In the heart of the unforgiving Arizona territory where the dust settles on secrets and the sun bleaches bones, a lone cowboy named Jedediah Jed Stone, a man more acquainted with the sting of whiskey than the warmth of kinship, made a choice that would echo through the canyons. He gave his last bullet, not for gold, not for glory, but for an Apache boy on the brink of death. This single act of defiance against a posse of his own kind would set in motion a chain of events that would test the very limits of loyalty, blur the lines between enemy and brother, and forever bind his fate to the people he was once taught to fear. This is the story of how one man's final act of desperation became a legend whispered on the wind. The sun was a merciless hammer in the vast ochre expanse of the Arizona desert. It beat down on the cracked earth, on the skeletal remains of saguaro cacti, and on the lone rider, a man who seemed as weathered and worn as the landscape itself, Jedediah. Jed Stone was his name, though it had been a long time since anyone had used it with anything other than a curse. A thick layer of dust caked his face, mingling with the sweat that trickled from beneath the brim of his battered Stetson. His horse, a weary roan named Rusty, plodded onward, its head hanging low, each step a testament to their shared exhaustion. Jed was a man on the run, though, from what even he was no longer entirely sure. The past was a murky river of whiskey-soaked memories and violent encounters, a current that had swept him far from the man he once was. All he knew was that the present was a desperate scramble for survival, a daily dance with hunger, thirst, and the ever-present fear of a bounty hunter's bullet. His saddlebags were nearly empty, containing little more than a half-empty canteen and a few strips of dried jerky. His Colt Peacemaker, tucked into its holster, held a single, precious cartridge. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long, eerie shadows across the canyon floor, a sound pricked Jed's ears. It was a faint, discordant noise, a blend of harsh, guttural yells and a child's terrified screams. Jed, whose instinct for self-preservation had been honed to a razor's edge, immediately reined in, Rusty guiding him behind a cluster of imposing rock formations. He dismounted his movements, slow and deliberate, every sense on high alert. Peering through a narrow gap in the rocks, Jed's gut tightened at the scene unfolding below. A posse of 4 men, their faces flushed with the heat and the thrill of the chase, had cornered a young Apache boy. The boy, no older than 10, stood with his back against a sheer rock face, his small frame trembling, but his dark eyes wide with a defiant fire. The remains of a small, hastily abandoned camp lay scattered around them. A smouldering fire, a few overturned baskets, and the still silent forms of what Jed presumed were the boy's family. The leader of the posse, a burly man with a cruel sneer and a greasy black beard, was Atticus Kane. Jed recognized him instantly. Kane was a bounty hunter of the worst sort, a man who reveled in the suffering of others, and whose reputation for brutality was whispered in hushed tones in every saloon and trading post from Tucson to Tombstone. He held a length of rope in one hand, coiling and uncoiling it with a sinister rhythm. "Nowhere left to run, you little savage," Kane snarled his voice, a low growl that carried on the still desert air. "Your thieving kind ain't welcome in this territory. We're here to cleanse it." The other men, a motley collection of rough-looking characters, chuckled in cruel amusement. They circled the boy like vultures, their rifles held loosely, their eyes glinting with a malevolent excitement. Jed watched his heart, a cold, hard knot in his chest. He was no friend to the Apache. He had fought them, feared them, and cursed them just like every other white man, trying to carve out a life in this harsh and unforgiving land. The smart thing to do, the safe thing to do, was to mount his horse and ride away to leave the boy to his grim fate, and to put as much distance as possible between himself and Atticus Cain. But as he looked at the boy, at the raw terror and the unwavering defiance in his young face, something stirred within Jed. It was a faint, almost forgotten echo of the man he had been before the whiskey, and the violence had consumed him, a man who had once believed in something more than just his own survival. He saw not an Apache, not an enemy, but a child alone and helpless against a tide of hatred. Cain took a step closer to the boy, the rope now held taut in his hands. "Time to pay the price for your people's sins," he said, his voice dripping with venom. And in that moment, Jed made a choice. It was a reckless, foolhardy choice, a choice that went against every instinct for self-preservation he had so carefully cultivated. But it was a choice he knew, with a sudden and startling clarity, that he had to make. With a deep breath, he drew his Colt Peacemaker, the cold steel, a familiar and comforting weight in his hand. He took aim not at Cain, but at the rope in his hand. He had one bullet. He couldn't afford to miss. The crack of the gunshot echoed through the canyon, a sharp, deafening report that shattered the tense silence. The rope in Cain's hand snapped, the frayed ends falling limp at his sides. The posse, startled by the unexpected attack, spun around their rifles, now raised and ready. Jed stepped out from behind the rocks, his face a grim mask, his peacemaker still raised, though he knew it was now nothing more than a useless piece of metal. "Let the boy go, Cain," Jed said, his voice low and steady, belying the frantic thumping of his own heart. Cain's eyes widened in a mixture of surprise and recognition. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, his voice a low, dangerous purr. "Jedediah Stone. I thought I smelled the stench of a fugitive on the wind." He gestured to the boy, who remained frozen against the rock face, his eyes now fixed on Jed. "This little savage, your new partner, I always knew you had a soft spot for the natives." I said, "Let him go." Jed repeated, his voice harder this time. Cain laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You're in no position to be making demands, Stone. You're outnumbered, outgunned, and you've got a price on your head big enough to make a man rich." He turned to his men. "What are you waiting for? Kill him." The posse advanced, their rifles aimed at Jed's chest. Jed stood his ground, his eyes locked on Cain, a silent challenge passing between them. He knew he was about to die. But as he looked at the Apache boy, at the flicker of hope that had ignited in his young eyes, he felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time, in a long time, he was not running. He was making a stand. But then something unexpected happened. The boy, who had been silent and still throughout the entire ordeal, suddenly sprang into action. With a speed and agility that belied his small stature, he darted forward, scooping up a handful of dirt and flinging it into the face of the nearest posse member. The man roared in pain and surprise, his rifle shot going wide. In that moment of confusion, Jed reacted. He lunged forward, tackling another of the posse members and sending him crashing to the ground. The third man, caught off guard, hesitated for a fraction of a second, and that was all the opening Jed needed. He scrambled to his feet, grabbing the boy's arm. "Run!" he yelled, and together they fled into the labyrinthine maze of canyons, the enraged shouts of Cain and his men echoing behind them. They were alive for now, But they were also unarmed, with a relentless and ruthless enemy on their trail, and a long, perilous journey ahead of them. The desert was a harsh and unforgiving mistress, and their chances of survival were slim. But as they ran hand in hand, a strange and unexpected bond was forged between the fugitive cowboy and the Apache boy, a bond that would be tested in the crucible of the Wild West and would forever change the course of both their lives. The first few hours of their flight were a blur of adrenaline and fear. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs ached, scrambling over rocks and through thorny brush, the sounds of the posse growing fainter with each passing minute. When they finally dared to stop, the sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple. They were hidden deep within a narrow, winding canyon, the towering rock walls providing a temporary sense of security. Jed collapsed onto the hard, unforgiving ground, his body screaming in protest. The boy, whose name Jed still did not know, stood a few feet away, his chest heaving, his small frame trembling, but his eyes were sharp and alert, constantly scanning their surroundings. The silence between them was as vast and empty as the desert itself. Jed, never a man for idle chatter, was even less inclined to it now. He was a man of action, not words, and the current situation called for a clear head and a steady hand, both of which he felt he was sorely lacking. The whiskey he had craved just hours before now seemed like a distant, foolish indulgence. He needed to think, to plan, to find a way out of this mess. The boy, for his part, remained a slant, enigmatic presence. He moved with a quiet grace that was at odds with the harshness of their environment, his moccasin-clad feet making no sound on the rocky ground. He would occasionally disappear for a few minutes, only to reappear with a handful of berries or a piece of edible root, which he would offer to Jed with a silent, solemn gesture. Jed at first was hesitant to accept. He had been taught to view the Apache as savages, as a people to be feared and eradicated. But as the days wore on, and his hunger grew more gnawing, he found himself reluctantly accepting the boy's offerings. The berries were tart, but nourishing, the roots earthy and filling. The boy, it seemed, knew the secrets of the desert secrets that were a closed book to a white man like Jed. Their journey was a relentless test of endurance. The days were scorching, the nights bitingly cold. Water was a constant, desperate concern. The boy, with an instinct that bordered on the supernatural, always seemed to know where to find it. A hidden spring, trickling from a rock face, a shallow pool collected in a shaded basin. One afternoon, as they were making their way through a particularly treacherous stretch of rocky terrain, Jed, his mind clouded by fatigue and dehydration, failed to see the rattlesnake coiled in the shade of a large boulder. He was just about to step on it when the boy let out a sharp cry and yanked him back. The snake struck its fangs, sinking into the empty air where Jed's leg had been just a moment before. Jed's heart hammered against his ribs. He had been a hair's breadth away from a slow, agonizing death. He looked at the boy, at the genuine fear and concern in his young eyes, and for the first time he saw him not as an Apache, but as a fellow human being who had just saved his life. "Thank you," Jed said the words, feeling foreign and clumsy on his tongue. The boy simply nodded, his expression unreadable. He then knelt down, and with a small, sharp stone, he began to draw in the dirt. He drew a picture of a man, a woman, and a child, and then he pointed to himself. "Taza," he said, his voice soft and clear. It was the first time Jed had heard him speak a full word. Taza. Jed repeated the name, feeling strange and unfamiliar. Taza then pointed to the drawing of the man and woman and made a gesture of sleeping. Then he pointed to the sky. Jed understood. His parents were dead, killed by Cain and his men. A wave of guilt washed over him. If he had been there sooner, if he had done something different, maybe they would still be alive. The incident with the snake marked a subtle but significant shift in their relationship. The wall of mistrust and suspicion that had separated them began to crumble, replaced by a fragile, unspoken understanding. They were two lost souls, bound together by a shared enemy and a common goal: survival. Jed began to see the desert not as a barren wasteland, but as a place of hidden life and subtle beauty, a world that Tarzan navigated with a skill and an intimacy that was both humbling and awe-inspiring. Tarzan, in turn, began to see Jed not as a white eye, an enemy of his people, but as a man who, despite his gruff exterior, possessed a core of decency and a fierce protective loyalty. But the specter of Atticus Cain and his posse loomed large, a constant menacing shadow on the horizon. They knew they were being hunted, that Cain, a man known for his relentless and obsessive nature, would not give up easily. They saw signs of their pursuit: a discarded cigarette butt, a fresh horse track, the distant faint sound of a rifle shot. One evening, as they huddled around a small, smokeless fire that Tarzan had expertly built in a shallow cave, Jed knew they couldn't keep running forever. They were weak, exhausted, and they had no weapon to defend themselves. Desperation was a cold, hard knot in his stomach. He needed a plan, a way to turn the tables on their pursuers. And then an idea began to form in his mind, a risky, dangerous idea, but one that might be their only chance. He would go to Fort McDowell, a place from his past, a place he had sworn never to return to. It was a long shot, a gamble with his life. But as he looked at Tarzan, at the boy who had saved him, who had trusted him, he knew it was a risk he had to take. The ghost of Fort McDowell was waiting, and Jed knew he had to face it for both their sakes. The desert had tested their bodies. Now the fort would test their souls. The decision to go to Fort McDowell settled in Jed's gut like a lead weight. The fort was more than just a military outpost. For Jed, it was a mausoleum of memories, a place where his past was buried, and he had no desire to be the one to excavate it. But desperation was a powerful motivator, and their current situation was as desperate as it got. They needed supplies, a weapon, and a horse that wasn't on the verge of collapse. The fort, or at least its periphery, was their only hope. "We're going to a fort," Jed told Tarzan, his voice low and raspy. He drew a rough map in the dirt, a crude representation of their location and their destination. "It's dangerous. There will be soldiers, white men. You need to stay hidden, no matter what." Tarzan listened, his dark eyes fixed on Jed's face, a silent understanding passing between them. He trusted Jed, but he also knew the dangers that awaited them. The white eyes were his enemies, the men who had destroyed his family and his home. To willingly walk into their domain was a terrifying prospect. But he also knew that Jed was their only hope, and he would follow him no matter the risk. The journey to Fort McDowell was a slow, arduous one. They traveled by night using the cover of darkness to avoid detection, and rested during the day in the relative coolness of caves and canyons. Jed's knowledge of the terrain combined with Tarzan's instincts kept them safe from prying eyes. As they drew closer to the fort, the landscape began to change. The desolate, rocky terrain gave way to a more verdant, though still rugged landscape. They saw signs of civilization: a discarded wagon wheel, a faded wooden signpost, the distant, faint sound of a blacksmith's hammer. Finally, one evening, they stood on a ridge overlooking the fort. It was a formidable structure, a collection of adobe buildings surrounded by a high wooden stockade. The American flag fluttered in the breeze, a symbol of both protection and oppression, depending on which side of the wall you stood. Jed's breath caught in his throat. The sight of the fort brought a flood of memories rushing back. Memories he had tried so hard to bury. He had been a soldier here once, a young idealistic man who believed in honor and duty. But the fort had a way of corrupting even the most virtuous of souls. The boredom, the isolation, the constant low-level warfare with the Apache, it had all taken its toll, chipping away at his moral compass until there was nothing left but a hollow shell of the man he once was. He remembered the endless patrols, the skirmishes in the desert, the faces of the men he had killed, both Apache and white. He remembered the whiskey-fueled brawls in the cantina, the empty promises of glory and riches, the pervasive sense of disillusionment that had settled over the fort like a plague. And he remembered Sergeant Miller, a man as jaded and corrupt as the fort itself. Miller had been his commanding officer, a man who had taught him that the only rule in the Wild West was to look out for yourself. It was Miller who had introduced him to the darker side of life at the fort, the smuggling, the gambling, the backroom deals that lined the pockets of the powerful and exploited the weak. It was Miller who had been there the night everything went wrong, the night a payroll shipment had gone missing, and Jed had been framed for the crime. He had escaped, but not before Miller had made it clear that if he ever showed his face again, he would be a dead man. "I need to go in alone," Jed told Taza, his voice tight. "You wait here. If I'm not back by sunrise, you run. You run as far and as fast as you can, and you don't look back." Taza's eyes widened in protest. He didn't want to be left alone. He didn't want to be separated from the one person who had shown him kindness in a world that had only shown him cruelty. But he saw the look in Jed's eyes, a mixture of fear and determination, and he knew he had no choice. He simply nodded his small face, a mask of worry. Jed slipped away into the darkness, his heart pounding in his chest. He moved with the stealth of a predator, his senses on high alert. He knew the fort's layout, its blind spots, its hidden entrances and exits. He made his way to the back of the fort, to a section of the stockade that was in a state of disrepair, a place where a man could slip through unnoticed if he was careful. He found what he was looking for, a loose plank just wide enough for him to squeeze through. He took a deep breath and slid through the opening. His body tense, every muscle coiled and ready to spring into action. He was inside. The fort was quiet, most of the soldiers asleep in their barracks. A few lanterns cast a flickering, anemic light on the dusty parade ground. He made his way to the stables, his movements swift and silent. He needed a horse, a strong, fast horse that could carry them to safety. He found a magnificent black stallion, a powerful animal that was clearly the pride of the fort. He began to untie it, his hands working quickly, his eyes constantly scanning the shadows. He was just about to lead the horse out of the stable when a voice from behind him made him freeze. "Well, well, well. Look what the cat dragged in." Jed's blood ran cold. He knew that voice. He turned slowly, his hand instinctively going for the empty holster on his hip. Sergeant Miller stood in the doorway of the stable, a lantern in one hand, a smirk on his face. He was older, his face more lined, his gut thicker, but his eyes were still the same, cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of compassion. "I told you what would happen if you ever came back here," Stone Miller said, his voice a low, menacing growl. "I'm just passing through, Miller." Jed said, his voice steady, though his heart was racing. "I don't want any trouble." Miller laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "You are trouble, Stone. You always have been. And you've got a hefty price on your head now. Enough to make me forget our past disagreements." He raised the lantern, the light illuminating Jed's face. "You look like hell, Stone. The desert hasn't been kind to you. I've had better days." Jed admitted his mind racing, trying to find a way out of this. "I'll bet you have," Miller said, his eyes glinting with a cruel amusement. "But your luck has just run out." He raised his other hand, and Jed saw the glint of a pistol. He was trapped. There was no way out. He was going to die here, in this dusty, forgotten fort, a victim of his own past. But then a diversion. A commotion at the edge of the fort, shouts and the sound of running feet. Miller's head snapped in the direction of the noise, his attention momentarily diverted. In that split second, Jed acted. He kicked out his boot, connecting with Miller's wrist. The pistol clattered to the ground. Jed lunged for it, but Miller was faster. He tackled Jed, and they both went down in a heap, fists flying, grunts and curses filling the air. They were evenly matched, two desperate men fighting for their lives. But Jed was fueled by a desperation that Miller couldn't match. He was fighting not just for himself, but for the boy waiting for him on the ridge. He managed to get the upper hand, pinning Miller to the ground, his forearm pressed against his throat. "Don't do it!" Stone Miller choked out, his eyes wide with fear. "You kill me, and you'll have the whole fort on your tail." Jed hesitated. He could end it right here, right now. He could silence the ghost of his past. Forever. But as he looked down at the pathetic, gasping man beneath him, he saw not a monster, but a reflection of himself. A man who had made all the wrong choices for all the wrong reasons. He let him go. He grabbed the pistol and a pouch of ammunition, and he ran. He ran as fast as he could, the sounds of the fort's alarm bells ringing in his ears. He scrambled back through the loose plank in the stockade, his heart pounding, his lungs burning. He reached the ridge where Taza was waiting, his eyes wide, with a mixture of fear and relief. "We have to go," Jed said, his voice breathless. "Now!" He helped Taza onto the black stallion, and they rode off into the night, the shouts and the gunshots of the fort fading behind them. They were alive and they were armed, but they were also more exposed than ever. Jed had faced the ghost of his past, and he had survived. But he knew with a sinking feeling in his gut that the past was not done with him yet. And as they rode deeper into the desert, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were riding not towards safety, but towards an even greater danger. The black stallion, a creature of pure power and untamed spirit, carried them through the night with a speed and endurance that Rusty in his prime could only have dreamed of. Jed, with Taza holding on tightly behind him, pushed the horse to its limits. The wind whipping at their faces, the rhythmic thud of its hooves, a desperate drumbeat against the silent desert floor. They rode for hours, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the fort. When the first faint hint of dawn appeared on the eastern horizon, Jed finally allowed the stallion to slow to a trot, its flanks heaving, its coat slick with sweat. They had escaped, but the close call at the fort had left its mark. Jed was on edge, his nerves raw, every shadow a potential threat, every sound a harbinger of danger. He knew that Miller, his pride wounded, and his greed stoked by the bounty on Jed's head, would not let the matter rest. He would send men after them, trackers who knew the desert as well as he did. But as the days turned into a week, and the vast, empty expanse of the desert remained just that, vast and empty. A fragile sense of security began to take hold. They saw no signs of pursuit, no dust clouds on the horizon, no fresh tracks in the sand. It seemed for now that they had shaken their pursuers. The journey, however, was far from over. They were still fugitives in a hostile land, their supplies dwindling, their future uncertain. And as their immediate danger subsided, a new, more subtle challenge emerged, the growing bond between them, a bond that was both a source of strength and a potential source of conflict. Taza, who had been a silent, watchful presence, began to open up. He started to speak, not just in single words, but in short, hesitant sentences, a mixture of his native Apache and the broken English he had picked up from his limited contact with the white world. He told Jed about his people, the White Mountain Apache, a proud and resilient tribe who had lived in these mountains for generations. He spoke of their traditions, their beliefs, their deep connection to the land. He taught Jed how to read the signs of the desert, how to find water where there seemed to be none, how to identify the plants that could heal and the ones that could kill. Jed, in turn, found himself listening with a surprising eagerness. He had always seen the Apache as a faceless, monolithic enemy, a savage horde that needed to be tamed or eradicated. But through Taza's stories, he began to see them as a people with a rich and complex culture, a people who had suffered greatly at the hands of his own kind. He learned that Taza's father, a respected warrior named Dasoda Hai, had been a man of peace, a leader who had tried to find a way for his people to coexist with the white settlers. But his efforts had been met with betrayal and violence, culminating in the brutal attack that had claimed his life and left Taza an orphan. As Taza spoke of his father, his voice thick with a mixture of grief and pride, Jed felt a familiar pang of guilt. He had been a part of the system that had destroyed Taza's world, a soldier in the army that had driven his people from their ancestral lands. He had never personally harmed an Apache child, but he had been complicit in the larger violence, a cog in the machine of conquest. The weight of his past, a past he had tried so hard to outrun, seemed to press down on him with a new and crushing force. He was a fugitive, a man with a price on his head, a man who had brought nothing but trouble and sorrow to the one person who had shown him kindness. One evening, as they sat by a small fire, the vast, star-studded sky stretching above them like a dark velvet blanket, Taza made a proposal that would change the course of their journey. "We go to my people," he said, his voice soft but firm. "They will help us." Jed's first instinct was to refuse. To walk into an Apache camp as a white man was suicide. He would be seen as an enemy, a threat, a representative of the very people who had brought them so much suffering. "They will kill me, Taza," he said, his voice grim. "No," Taza insisted, his eyes pleading. "I will tell them you saved me. I will tell them you are my friend." Jed looked at the boy, at the unwavering trust in his young face, and he felt a wave of conflict wash over him. He was tired of running, tired of being alone. The thought of a community, of a place where he might find some semblance of peace, was a powerful temptation. But the risk was enormous. He remembered the stories he had heard from other soldiers. Stories of white men who had been captured by the Apache, stories of torture and slow, agonizing death. He had no reason to believe his fate would be any different. But then he looked at his own reflection in Taza's dark eyes, and he saw not a hardened killer, but a lost and broken man, a man who was desperate for a second chance. He had given his last bullet for this boy. He had faced down his own past for him, Maybe it was time to trust him to take a leap of faith into the unknown. "All right, Taza," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "We'll go to your people." The decision was made. They would journey to the heart of Apache territory, to the hidden stronghold of the White Mountain tribe. It was a journey into the lion's den, a gamble with the highest possible stakes. But as they set out the next morning, a sense of purpose, a sense of hope seemed to lighten their steps. They were no longer just running from something. They were running towards something, towards a future that was as uncertain as it was tantalizing. The whispers on the wind, the ancient secrets of the desert, had guided them this far. Now they would have to trust that those same whispers would lead them to a place of refuge, a place where a fugitive cowboy and an Apache boy could find a home. But the path ahead was fraught with peril, and the trial of the white man was just beginning. The journey to the White Mountain Apache stronghold was a pilgrimage into a world Jed had only ever seen through the sights of a rifle. Taza, now their guide, led them through a landscape that became increasingly wild and untamed, a labyrinth of canyons and mesas that seemed designed by nature itself to repel outsiders. The black stallion, though powerful, struggled on the treacherous paths, and they were forced to dismount and lead it for long stretches. As they ventured deeper into Apache territory, a palpable sense of being watched settled over Jed. He saw fleeting shadows on distant ridges, heard the faint, almost imperceptible snap of a twig in the underbrush. They were not alone. The whispers on the wind had carried news of their approach, and the eyes of the Apache were upon them. Finally, after days of arduous travel, they arrived. The Apache camp was nestled in a hidden valley, a collection of wickiups, dome-shaped dwellings made of branches and hides, clustered around a central fire. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat, and the sounds of a vibrant community. The laughter of children, the rhythmic chanting of a medicine man, the murmur of conversation, filled the valley. But as Jed and Taza emerged from the tree line, a sudden chilling silence fell over the camp. Every eye turned towards them, and the expressions on the faces of the Apache were not of welcome, but of suspicion and hostility. A group of warriors, their faces grim, their rifles held at the ready, quickly surrounded them, their dark eyes boring into Jed with an unnerving intensity. Jed's hand instinctively went to the pistol on his hip, but he knew it would be a futile gesture. He was hopelessly outnumbered. His fate now rested entirely on Taza's shoulders. Taza, seeing the fear in Jed's eyes, stepped forward, his small frame radiating a courage that belied his years. He addressed the warriors in his native tongue, his voice clear and strong, a torrent of words that Jed could not understand, but whose emotional weight was undeniable. He gestured to Jed, then to himself, his hands weaving a story of their shared journey, of the posse of the last bullet, of the rattlesnake of the fort. The warriors listened, their expressions unreadable. When Taza had finished, a tall, imposing man with a stern, weathered face and eyes that held the wisdom and sorrow of a lifetime stepped forward. He was Cochise Taza's uncle and the chief of the White Mountain Apache. He looked at Jed, his gaze sharp and penetrating, as if he could see into the very depths of his soul. He spoke in a low, guttural voice, and one of the younger warriors, who knew some English, translated. "Why is this white man here?" The translator asked, his voice flat and emotionless. "He saved my life," Taza said, his voice unwavering. "He is my friend." Cochise's gaze remained fixed on Jed. A white man's friendship is a fleeting thing, like a desert mirage. It promises water, but delivers only sand. He then gestured to two of his warriors. "Take him." Jed's heart sank. He was a prisoner. The warriors grabbed his arms, their grip like iron. They led him to the center of the camp and tied him to a wooden post, his hands bound tightly behind his back. The trial of the white man had begun. For the rest of the day, Jed remained tied to the post, a spectacle for the entire village. The people of the camp, men, women, and children, would walk by their faces a mixture of curiosity, anger, and grief. They saw in him not an individual, but a symbol of their suffering, a representative of the people who had stolen their land, killed their families, and destroyed their way of life. Some spat at him, their faces contorted in hatred. Others threw stones, their aim true, their anger palpable. An old woman, her face a mask of sorrow, approached him and began to wail her voice, a heart-breaking lament for a husband and a son she had lost to the white man's bullets. Jed endured it all in silence, his head held high, though his heart was heavy with a shame he had never known before. He saw in their faces the human cost of the conflict. He had once been a part of the deep, raw wounds that his people had inflicted upon theirs. Taza remained by his side throughout the ordeal, a silent, steadfast presence. He would bring him water, his small hands struggling to hold the gourd steady. He would try to shield him from the thrown stones, his small body a fragile but determined barrier. His loyalty was a beacon of light in the darkness of Jed's despair. As night fell, a council of elders gathered around the central fire. Cochise presided over the meeting, his face grim, his expression unreadable. The fate of the white man was to be decided. Taza, his voice trembling, but his resolve unshaken once again, pleaded Jed's case. He spoke with a passion and an eloquence that moved even the most hardened of warriors. He told them of Jed's courage, of his selflessness, of the bond they had forged in the crucible of the desert. But his words were met with skepticism and anger. Other warriors spoke, their voices raised in a chorus of outrage. They spoke of the broken treaties, the stolen land, the massacres of their people. They saw Jed as an enemy, a spy, a threat that needed to be eliminated. The debate raged on for hours, the firelight casting flickering shadows on the faces of the council members. Jed's life hung in the balance, a single thread in a complex tapestry of history, hatred, and hope. As the arguments reached a fever pitch, a new voice entered the fray. It was Geronimo, the tribe's medicine man, a revered elder whose wisdom was sought by all. He had been silent throughout the proceedings, his ancient eyes as dark and deep as the night sky fixed on Jed. He rose to his feet, his movements slow and deliberate, and a hush fell over the council. He spoke in a low, raspy voice, his words carrying the weight of a lifetime of experience. He did not speak of Jed's guilt or innocence. He spoke of the spirits, of the interconnectedness of all living things, of the strange and mysterious ways of the universe. He spoke of the boy Taza and the unexplainable bond he had formed with the white man. The spirits work in ways we do not always understand, Geronimo said, his voice resonating with a quiet power. They have brought this man to us for a reason. To kill him without understanding that reason would be to show disrespect to the spirits, to invite their displeasure. He proposed a test, a trial by ordeal. If Jed was truly a friend, if his heart was pure, he would survive. If he was an enemy, the spirits would deliver their own justice. Cochise, his face still grim, considered Geronimo's words. He looked at Taza, at the unwavering loyalty in his young nephew's eyes. He looked at Jed, at the man who had endured the scorn and hatred of his people with a quiet dignity. Finally he nodded. The white man would be given a chance to prove himself, but it would be a trial of fire, a test of courage and endurance that would push him to the very limits of his being. The trial of the white man was not over. It had just entered its most dangerous and decisive phase. The trial, as devised by Geronimo and decreed by Cochise, was to be a test of survival, a journey into the heart of the Apache's sacred lands. Jed was to be taken to the base of the Chiricahua Mountains, a place of immense spiritual significance to the tribe, and left with nothing but a knife and a canteen of water. He was to survive for 3 days and 3 nights, and if he returned, he would be deemed worthy of their trust. If he failed, the desert would claim him a fitting end for a man whose people had brought so much death and destruction to the land. As the warriors prepared for the journey, a sense of foreboding settled over Jed. He had survived the desert before, but that was with Taza by his side. To face it alone with only a knife for protection and a single canteen of water was a daunting, if not impossible, task. Taza pleaded with his uncle to let him go with Jed, but Cochise was adamant. This was a trial for the white man alone. Taza's loyalty had been proven. Now it was Jed's turn. The journey to the mountains was a somber affair. Jed, his hands still bound, was placed on a horse and led by a group of stone-faced warriors. Taza followed on foot, his eyes red with unshed tears, his small face a mask of worry. When they reached the designated spot, a desolate, rocky expanse at the foot of the towering mountains, the warriors unbound Jed and gave him the knife and the canteen. They then turned and rode away without a word, leaving him alone in the vast, silent wilderness. The first day was a struggle for survival. The sun was a relentless tormentor, and the water in his canteen dwindled at an alarming rate. He used his knife to dig for roots, his stomach churning with a hunger that was both physical and existential. He was alone, utterly and completely alone, and the weight of his solitude was a crushing burden. As night fell, he found shelter in a small cave, the darkness a welcome respite from the oppressive heat. But the night brought its own terrors, the sounds of the desert, the yip of a coyote, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of some unseen creature in the brush, were magnified in the silence, each sound a potential threat. He thought of Taza, of the boy's unwavering faith in him. He thought of the life he had left behind, the life of a fugitive, a man with no home, no family, no purpose. He had been given a second chance, a chance to prove himself, to earn a place in a world he had once sought to destroy. He would not fail. The next 2 days were a blur of hardship and determination. He used the skills that Taza had taught him, finding water in the most unlikely of places, identifying edible plants, setting crude traps for small game. He was no longer just a white man in a hostile land. He was a student of the desert, a humble supplicant to its harsh but beautiful laws. On the 3rd day, as he was making his way back towards the Apache camp, a sense of triumph welling in his chest, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A group of riders, their faces obscured by the distance, were approaching the valley where the Apache camp was located. They were not Apache. They were white men, and they were heavily armed, and leading them was a man whose silhouette was burned into Jed's memory, Atticus Kane. A wave of dread washed over Jed. Kane had found them. He had tracked them to the Apache stronghold, his obsession with the bounty on Jed's head overriding any semblance of caution or reason. Jed knew he had to warn the Apache. He ran his tired legs, screaming in protest, his lungs burning. He scrambled up a rocky outcrop that overlooked the valley, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. From his vantage point, he could see the camp, and he could see Cain and his men now dismounted and taking up positions on the ridge opposite him. They were preparing for an ambush. And then he saw Taza. The boy was playing by the stream at the edge of the camp, blissfully unaware of the danger that was about to descend upon him. Cain saw him too. A cruel smile spread across his face. He had found his bait. Before Jed could react, 2 of Cain's men descended on Taza, grabbing him and dragging him back up the ridge. The boy's terrified screams echoed through the valley, a sound that pierced Jed's heart like a knife. The Apache camp erupted in a flurry of activity. Warriors grabbed their rifles, their faces a mixture of confusion and rage. But they were caught off guard, their camp exposed, their children vulnerable. Cain, holding Taza in front of him as a human shield, yelled out his voice, a triumphant roar. "Stone, I know you're out there. Come out and face me, or the boy dies." Jed was trapped. If he revealed himself, he would be a clear target for Cain's men. If he didn't, Taza would be killed. But then something unexpected happened. A small group of Apache warriors, the same ones who had taken him to the mountains, appeared at his side. They had seen the ambush, and they had come to help. "We will fight with you, white man," the lead warrior said, his voice grim but resolute. "You have proven your heart. You are one of us now." A surge of gratitude and a fierce, protective loyalty washed over Jed. He was no longer alone. He had allies, brothers in arms. He quickly devised a plan, a risky, desperate plan, that combined his knowledge of Cain's tactics with the Apache's intimate knowledge of the terrain. They would use the element of surprise, the cover of the canyons, to turn the tables on their attackers. The battle that followed was a brutal, chaotic affair. It was a clash of 2 worlds, a fight for survival, for honor, for the life of a boy who had become the unlikely bridge between them. Jed, armed with a rifle, given to him by one of the warriors, fought with a ferocity he had never known before. He was no longer just fighting for his own life. He was fighting for his new family, for the people who had taken him in, who had given him a home. He used the Apache tactics he had been taught, moving with a stealth and a silence that was at odds with his white man's upbringing. He and his Apache allies picked off Cain's men one by one, their ghostly presence and deadly accuracy sowing confusion and terror in the ranks of the bounty hunters. Finally, it was just Jed and Cain, 2 old partners, 2 bitter enemies facing each other across a rocky expanse. It didn't have to be this way. Stone Cain snarled, his face contorted in a mask of rage and frustration. "You're right, Cain," Jed said, his voice cold and steady. It didn't. He then revealed the truth he had carried with him for so long. He told Cain that he knew about the payroll, about the frame-up, about the betrayal that had sent him on the run. Cain, his face a mixture of surprise and guilt, hesitated for a fraction of a second. And in that moment, Jed acted. He lunged forward, not with his rifle, but with his knife, the same knife that had been his only companion in the desert. The fight was a brutal hand-to-hand struggle, a dance of desperation and death. But Jed, fueled by a righteous anger and a fierce determination to protect his new family, was the stronger of the 2. He managed to disarm Cain, and with a final desperate lunge, he plunged the knife into his shoulder, wounding him, but not killing him. As Cain lay on the ground, his face a mask of pain and defeat. The remaining members of his posse, seeing their leader fall, lost their will to fight. They surrendered to the Apache warriors. Their reign of terror finally at an end. Jed, wounded but victorious, rushed to Taza's side. The boy was shaken but unharmed. He threw his arms around Jed's neck, his small body trembling with a mixture of fear and relief. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the valley, the Apache gathered around Jed. They looked at him not with suspicion and hostility, but with respect and admiration. He had faced their trial, and he had emerged victorious. He had saved one of their own, and he had helped to defeat a common enemy. Cochise approached him, his stern face softened by a rare smile. He placed a hand on Jed's shoulder. "You have the heart of an Apache Jedediah Stone," he said, his voice filled with a newfound respect. "You are no longer a white man in our land. You are one of us." And in a solemn ceremony, as the moon rose high in the night sky, Jed was made a blood brother to Taza and the White Mountain Apache. A small incision was made on both their arms, and their blood was mingled a sacred bond that would unite them forever. Jed, the fugitive cowboy. The man who had lost everything had found a new life, a new family, a new purpose. He had given his last bullet to save an Apache boy, and in return he had been given a gift beyond measure, the gift of brotherhood, the gift of belonging, the gift of a home. The battle's end brought a quiet dawn to the valley. While the Apache mourned their fallen warriors with solemn reverence, a sense of profound victory settled over the camp. Atticus Kane and his surviving men were captured, their threat extinguished. As the warriors gathered the bounty hunters' belongings, a discovery was made that would sever the last chains of Jed's past, Kane's leather-bound journal. Within its pages, in Kane's own arrogant scrawl, was a full confession to the payroll robbery and the deliberate framing of Jedediah Stone. The journal was undeniable proof of his innocence. Understanding the power of the white man's written word, Cochise sent the book and the prisoners to Fort McDowell under a flag of truce. Faced with such irrefutable evidence, the fort's commander acted swiftly. An official pardon was issued, clearing Jed's name and wiping the bounty from his head. He was, for the first time in years, a free man. The news arrived with a military envoy, not as a threat, but as a peace offering. The path back to the white world was now clear. Jed could reclaim a life he thought was lost forever, a life of towns, ranches, and familiar comforts. Yet as he stood on the ridge overlooking the Apache camp, with Taza standing steadfastly by his side, he felt no pull to return. He looked at the rugged faces of the people who had tested him, fought beside him, and named him brother. He saw the wickiup that was now his home. The white world held only ghosts and bitter memories. This harsh, beautiful land held his future, his family. He had arrived in the desert as a broken fugitive stripped of everything. But here among the people he was once taught to hate. He had found something far more valuable than a clean slate. He had found his honor, his purpose, and a brotherhood forged in fire and blood. Jedediah Stone, the cowboy with the Apache heart, had finally come home. He chose to stay his life forever bound to the tribe that had saved him, a living testament to the fact that sometimes a man must lose everything to truly find himself. And so the tale of Jedediah Stone and the Apache boy, Taza, comes to a close. It's a powerful reminder that even in the most brutal of times, in the heart of a land torn apart by hatred and conflict, the bonds of humanity can prevail. It shows us that courage isn't just about facing down an enemy with a gun, but about facing down your own prejudice with an open heart. Jed's journey from a haunted fugitive to a respected brother is a testament to the idea that our past doesn't have to define our future, and that family can be found in the most unexpected of places. If this story of bravery, loyalty, and redemption resonated with you, please take a moment to hit that like button and share it with others who appreciate a true life drama from the Wild West. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories of the unsung heroes and forgotten legends of our past. Your support helps us to keep these powerful narratives alive. Thank you for listening.